Today is Tuesday, July 15th, 2025. This is Quick Start from CBN News. I'm Dan Andros. A tragic scene unfolds at a Kentucky church. We'll have that top story and more on today's podcast, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating. You can email us as well. Quick Start Podcast at cbn.org. We're getting through all the news of the day here each and every morning, bright and early. Joining me today, CBN's Trey Goins-Phillips and Madison Seals. On the focus story, Yale University released a new poll that tracks the opinions of young American voters, compares them to the general population. Madison, some interesting findings here.
Yeah, it found some interesting differences in perspective on certain issues, which isn't necessarily surprising, but there's also some, I think, surprising similarities too. So we'll get into those results for today's focus.
All right, and on the main thing, a Catholic priest kidnapped by Boko Haram. The world has barely noticed. Billy Hallowell has more on that on the main thing. All right, make sure you subscribe to all of our CBN News podcasts. We've got several of them: Newsmakers, Faith and Culture, Navigating Trump 2.0, Heaven Meets Earth. As always, you can find the links to those podcasts. If you haven't done it yet, what are you waiting for? Check them out right there in the description of this and each and every Quick Start podcast episode. And with that, we are going to head to the news in 90 seconds. And investigators are probing the mental health of Air India pilot Captain Sumit Sabharwal, who was at the controls of a London-bound flight that crashed last month, killing 241 people. Reports suggest the veteran pilot had a history of depression, had taken medical and bereavement leave in recent years, and was even considering retirement. Preliminary findings show a critical engine fuel cutoff switch was flipped just 3 seconds after takeoff, though the reason remains unknown. The cockpit voice recorder captured one pilot asking the other, "Why did you hit the cutoff switch?" The response was, "I did not." So neither pilot admitted to touching it, and fuel cutoff switches are deliberately designed to prevent accidental activation. They're typically protected by guards or require very intentional movements, making it almost impossible to flip one unintentionally during a flight. Air India and its parent companies say the records have been handed over, but they're urging the public not to rush to judgment. And a terrifying series of events unfolded in Lexington, Kentucky Sunday, when a man ambushed a state trooper during a traffic stop and then later opened fire inside a church, killing 2 women. Beverly Gum and her daughter, Christina Combs, were killed. Combs, a mother of 5 with a 6-month-old baby, was set to graduate nursing school. Their husbands were wounded, and the gunman was killed by police. Those are just some of today's top headlines. You can check out more stories over at cbnnews.com. And Madison and Trey, just looking at the details on this Air India crash, and this is just crazy to me that somebody with even remotely mental issues would be allowed near a cockpit of a plane, that many lives on the line. And we'll wait for the investigation to conclude, but you can see on this cockpit voice recorder, the transcript of that, why did you hit the cutoff switch right after? I mean, that cuts fuel off to the engine. That's why it just went up and then ran out of fuel. It was not sucking in fuel anymore. So it just lost all of its power and went down. There's no recovering from that. Once you're, at that height, there's no chance you're just going to go down. So pretty crazy that this guy, if the records and everything appear to check out, that they were allowed to be kind of behind the, at the controls of this plane. But again, like I said, we'll wait for the findings to come in.
Yeah, if all the details check out and this is what happened, I can't imagine the devastation that the loved ones left behind are feeling, right? Because it's a tragedy no matter what happened. But if it's some sort of freak accident, then that's one thing. But when you hear that it was potentially something intentionally done, whether by somebody who is of sound mind or not is up for debate, but intentionally done nonetheless, it's like, well, this was entirely preventable. The 240 plus people who are no longer living, there was no reason for them to die. This was entirely, something that did not in any way have to happen and would not have happened had somebody not done something like pull a switch. So yeah, I think this is just devastating. And I have the same questions, Dan. I don't know why anybody with any sort of issues with mental health, if they're seeking treatment and they're getting taken care of and they have a record of being healthy, that's one thing if they've had a history. But for somebody to be actively dealing with mental health issues and to be allowed this close to a cockpit, that's troubling.
Right. Yeah, it's a tragedy that this pilot was dealing with depression and all of these issues, but in so many
Totally.
cases, people who are known to be dealing with things like that means that they're experiencing symptoms at a high level to the point where they have sought out help beyond just themselves. And so, yeah, it's interesting. I'd like to learn more about his history as a pilot, if there had been any other close calls or any other situations where somebody else was not able to depend on him. Because it sounds like, as a veteran pilot, that he'd been flying for a long time. And so I'm just curious what the rest of his background is. And yeah, it sounds like there's a lot more details that are needed and necessary here to prevent this from happening in the future to a pilot or the crew or anybody else on board.
Yeah. If, like I said, again, if indeed it checks out the qualifiers in there, I mean, we're still in the early stages of this, but this is what it looks like so far, given these recordings and the fact that you can't just, I mean, these switches don't just turn themselves off. They're, military grade essentially for a reason, because of how devastating the effects can be if you wrongly turn them off for some reason. So just a tragic situation all around, and certainly our prayers to all those families. Hopefully they get some closure there on that issue. All right, we are going to go to the focus story now. As we mentioned at the top of the podcast there, Yale University releasing a new poll. It's tracking the opinion, checking out young American voters and taking a look at how they stack up against the views of the general population. So let's start with who and what the poll is measuring. What are the details of it?
Well, it's called the Yale Youth Poll. So they have released some polls before measuring this age group, and it's an undergraduate-led research project at Yale University that polled young American voters aged 18 to 29. And it compares those results to the general population and even breaks down some of the results between the younger half of that age range versus the half that's closer to 30. The poll sampled over 4,000 registered voters, and 2,025 of those voters are aged 18 to 29. And the survey itself had questions ranging from immigration to finances, lots of different things. It covers everything from higher education to immigration. And it included a couple of tests called A/B tests that gauged people's response to the same issues framed in different ways. So, for example, using phrases like human rights to see if people would respond more supportively to homelessness issues than they otherwise would. So we can get into some of those results too, because that did impact that age group quite a bit.
Yeah, interesting. So what are some of the things that stood out the most in these results?
Well, the topic of immigration was one of the issues with the biggest generational divide. So we can start with that one. The survey found that young voters supported allowing asylum seekers who enter the country illegally to stay by a 25-point margin. And on a similar topic, the poll asked people about protest rights that turned out pretty similar results. When asked about the question of whether international students should be deported for protesting the war in Gaza, voters overall opposed deportation by 36 points, while young voters opposed deportation by 65 points. And they also differed on campus speech, with young voters supporting universities making political or social statements by a 6-point margin, while the broader electorate opposed such statements by a 13-point margin. And voters under 30 were split on whether teens aged 13 to 17 should be allowed access to gender transition treatments, which was an interesting topic to poll this age group on. And they were opposing it by just a 0.1 point margin in comparison to the broader electorate, which opposed it by 25 or 24 points. I think it's interesting, though, that there was a broad consensus across age groups that transgender athletes should not be allowed to compete in women's sports at the professional, college, or high school levels. And we've talked about this a lot on the podcast, and how there's almost this shift that we're seeing in a lack of support for transgender athletes competing in sports, because that is becoming such a popular, not popular, but such a common issue in universities across the country. People are starting to realize this is not a small issue affecting only a few people. And that's having an impact on young people and how they see the issue entirely. So the percentage of young people who thought it shouldn't be allowed ranged from 45 to 57%, depending on what level of competition we're talking about. They seem more supportive of transgender athletes participating in higher level sports, but not high school age. And maybe that's because of strength training and other things that could make high schoolers more vulnerable to being injured by males competing in the competition, although I think that could be argued against, but that's besides the point. And that those numbers are compared to 59 to 65% of all voters saying that it shouldn't be allowed. And the data also uncovered an interesting divide within the age group under 30. So when they were asked about whether they would vote for the Democratic or Republican candidate in the 2026 congressional elections in their district, voters aged 22 to 29 favored the Democratic candidate by a margin of about 6.4 points, but voters aged 18 to 21 favored the Republican by a margin of 11.7 points. So that's a pretty broad overview, but it's interesting to see the areas where there's more overlap between generations and why that may be, especially as we get closer to midterm elections.
Yeah, I mean, this is very interesting. I mean, I don't know, that divide within the young, and then that you just mentioned there at the end, the Democrats and the Republicans, the youngest ones, like I think it was 18, 21, you said, leaning Republican. I mean, to me, that kind of indicates maybe young people are sort of up for grabs when it comes to the electorate here in the next couple of years, right? Like even the lead you mentioned for those supporting the Democrats, so only 6 points. I mean, that's not, I mean, when we have these partisan divides on other age groups, it's usually like a 70 to 30 type situation, right? These are usually big divides. When you look at certain minorities, you have an 80 to 20 split. So that is 6 points is not a big split. So the fact that there are that close of numbers here, I mean, to me is super interesting. And I think, as you mentioned, it is indicative potentially of a shift going on. And I think that's sort of the battle that's happening right now. I think the dust has not settled on this yet. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, I think the numbers are certainly interesting when it comes to especially the political divide of, leaning Republican versus leaning more progressive with the youngest generation polled there. But one of the pieces of data that I found really interesting, Madison, if I was hearing you correctly, is that when it comes to older kids or when kids are older, like, well, if they want to have transgender athletes competing when they're older, then that's okay.
Yeah.
But I don't want them when they're younger. And I think that is interesting because it's indicative of the relativistic culture we live in, right? We decide what's true based on how we feel at the time, right? It's not but the reality is if it's a problem when a kid is in junior high or high school, it's still a problem when they're in collegiate
changed?
or professional sports.
What
Nothing is
changed there?
changing.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and it did seem like the older generations there was still some variation there between the different levels of competition, which is interesting that it was both the younger and the older had a little bit of a difference, because if it's an ideological viewpoint or biological viewpoint, whatever your stance is on it or wherever your stance is coming from, you would think it would be consistent throughout. Either transgender men are not females and they shouldn't be competing at all, or the opposite. But yeah, I did see that in both age groups, which is really interesting. But I think you're right. And I think part of the reason that it's important to consider the generational divides, especially as it comes to elections, is the language that we use and how politicians frame issues and educate people about them has a huge impact on how people perceive or vote on something. And that's one thing I didn't get to that the poll covered a bit when it used those two A/B tests to gauge the effect of framing progressive policies as quote unquote human rights, and whether providing voters with some basic information about things like government finances would change their views on things like the federal deficit or tax rates or spending levels. And the first message test found that arguing for progressive policies on homelessness on the grounds of human rights reduced support for the progressive position by 22 points. So it doesn't seem like that's a very effective way to argue that issue, but that's interesting that all it came down to was a difference in language and the background that the voters received when they were turning in their answers.
Yeah, and that is a frustrating thing a lot of times in these ballot initiatives and things like that. They word them so in such a clever and clunky way to kind of leave you wondering, what in the world does this measure actually do? I don't even know. So they do. I know they do that a lot of times, but this is where, I mean, Trey, you touched on it with the relativistic society that we're living in. I think so many young people, if they're not Christians, they are growing up sort of just, like you said, whatever makes me feel good, whatever sounds good. I mean, I watch, the algorithm knows I'm pro-life, and I watch, it gives me a lot of these street debates between, pro-lifers, abolitionists, and then pro-choicers and pro-abortion folks. And man, watching them try to argue, it's incredible hearing them just recite bumper stickers and not able to actually articulate an argument. It's incredible. And I realize some of those videos are like gotcha videos, and maybe you're not getting the cream of the crop of the arguing, but I would say I haven't seen people at the top of the heap on the abortion issue make a coherent argument. And of course, it's because I believe there really isn't one that is out there, but it's evident on an issue like that. And I think that's where a lot of these young people are. If you don't have your foundation in God, in the Word of God, and in the truths of God, you're going to leave yourself susceptible to these sorts of inconsistencies all day long, 24/7, and twice on Sunday.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a great point. I think relativism, and then also just there's an element of selfishness in that too, especially on the abortion argument, that you hear people talking about what are their rights. I don't really care what the rights are of the human being inside of me. And of course, they'll often debate whether or not the life inside of them is actually a life or not. But a lot of it is about, well, what if I want a career? What if I want to be able to be with whoever I want to be with without risks? And a lot of it is very inwardly focused. And of course, if you don't have the Holy Spirit living in you, then you have no reason to be concerned about others. Everything is just about you. So that definitely impacts, I think, a lot of the younger generation and older generation alike, too.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Madison, appreciate you bringing this one to the podcast today. We'll definitely be keeping an eye on those numbers in the future as they come out. All right, we're going to go to the main thing now. And Joel Veldkamp, head of international communications at Christian Solidarity International, sounding the alarm after a Catholic priest was reportedly abducted by the terror group Boko Haram in Nigeria. He joined Billy for today's main thing.
Joel Veldkamp, a lot to break down today and discuss surrounding Nigeria. Your organization, Christian Solidarity International, put out a statement about a Catholic priest who was recently taken hostage. What happened?
So this is Father Alphonsus Afina, and he operates in an area of Nigeria called Maiduguri. This is really ground zero for the Boko Haram terrorist movement that's been terrorizing Christians for almost 15 years now in Nigeria. And he is actually one of CSI's partners. So he helps us distribute food to people who have survived Boko Haram attacks and who are now displaced. They've had to flee their villages and live in camps in the main city of Maiduguri. So he's known to us. It's not just another, unfortunately, Christian priest or pastor who's been kidnapped in Nigeria. He's actually someone who has helped us to help Nigerian Christians suffering from persecution. And he and his team were going from one town to another in the region, and their convoy was attacked with RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades. One of our other partners, a man named Zion Japheth, was killed, actually, and then Father Alphonsus was abducted. His abductors forced him to call his bishop, tell him that he had been abducted. He got to ask the bishop to pray for him, and that's the last contact that we've had with him. That was on June 1st.
So that's over a month ago, and you have no idea how he is faring, if he's even alive at this point. You know nothing. You've heard nothing.
We haven't heard anything. He is the 15th or the 16th priest or pastor who's been kidnapped in Nigeria this year. Sometimes they want ransom money, and other times they're abducting them in order to kill them, in order to terrorize the Christian community. And the fact that we've heard so little just makes me worried, frankly.
Well, I was going to ask you that question of how often this is happening. The fact that you have 15 or 16 faith leaders who have been taken and abducted this year alone is horrifying. And I think it underscores the fact that there is a much bigger and broader issue going on here, which we'll talk about in a moment. But CSI, your organization, has put out a statement on this, and you're calling on the Nigerian government to get involved and do something. What precisely would you like to see them do?
Something to take the case seriously. It would be great to have the Nigerian president say something about this on the record. It would be great to have increased military and peacekeeping operations in Maiduguri. And frankly, we believe that there are figures in the Nigerian security establishment who have links to Boko Haram and who have links to other Islamic terrorist groups operating in Nigeria. And they should use those links to get this man home to his church, to his loved ones.
He's a partner, as you mentioned, so this would be horrifying no matter what, obviously, if you had a priest or a pastor being abducted. But this is a partner who works with CSI, who has helped. How does this affect your work, when this sort of thing happens on two different levels? A, the practical level of what he was helping with, and now that is being taken away. Obviously, the bigger issue is his well-being, but that's being taken away. And then the other factor, I would imagine, that people are hesitant to become partners if they're watching this sort of thing happen to people. So can you talk about those dynamics?
Yeah, absolutely. So Father Alphonsus was part of the Justice and Peace Development Commission run by the Catholic Church in Maiduguri. So his co-workers are now filling the role that he filled for us. So thankfully, our operations in Maiduguri are continuing relatively unhindered. But absolutely, this is a huge deterrent to other people who might want to join these sorts of relief efforts, because it is dangerous work. And I'm convinced that this is why he was kidnapped, because Boko Haram does want to terrorize people and to keep people from trying to help their fellow Nigerians who are suffering in this situation. And what makes Father Alphonsus so special, he's actually a new partner to us, because until 2024, he was living in Alaska. For 7 years, he worked with different dioceses in Alaska, in the United States. And he made the choice to return to Nigeria to serve his people. While he was in Alaska, he was taking special courses in counseling and therapy with the intention of helping Nigerians who have been traumatized by these attacks. So this is someone who went back into the fire to help his fellow Christians, to help his fellow Nigerians. And this is really an example of faith and service for all of us.
2024, you go back to 2022, I believe that was the year that you and I first started talking at CBN a lot more about these Nigerian issues. Those issues weren't new, but they were kicking up and they were becoming more mainstream because of the stoning of a college student that happened that year. So he chose to go back into a situation 2 years later that was dire and difficult and horrific. And we're hinting at some of that right now. But for those who are watching or listening and they don't know, they don't understand just how bad this persecution is in Nigeria, and keeping in mind that this is a country, and this may seem strange to people, that, and correct me if I'm wrong on the numbers, are roughly half are Christian, half are Muslims. This is not a country where it's 98% Muslim and 2% Christian. And yet you have this intensive Islamic radical behavior that is killing Christians. Can you just talk about, from a 30,000-foot level, what is actually happening in Nigeria right now?
Sure. So Nigeria is the deadliest place in the world to be a Christian. More Christians are killed for their faith in Nigeria than any other country in the world by far. And as you point out, Nigeria is about half Christian and half Muslim. Nigeria is an enormous country. There are almost 200 million people living there. And most Christians live in the south, although many Muslims live there as well. And the north of Nigeria is mostly Muslim. And it's in the north that we're seeing the most intense violence against Christians. Beginning in 2009, extremist groups like Boko Haram, which later aligned with ISIS, with the Islamic State, started a campaign to wipe out Christianity in northern Nigeria. That was their goal. All the Christians should convert or be killed or leave. There's another region of Nigeria called the Middle Belt that's mixed Muslim and Christian. And in this area, we're seeing groups drawn from the Fulani ethnic group attacking Christian village after Christian village and just massacring the people and driving the survivors away. So in the middle belt of Nigeria, you're seeing a kind of a slow ethnic cleansing process. They're trying to turn a religiously mixed region into a region that's all Muslims. And this really has to do with the efforts of the security elite in Nigeria to stay on top of the country and to keep from losing their power and their privilege. They're using these groups as instruments of their power. So it's extremely grim. And unfortunately, the United States doesn't seem that interested in doing anything about it. The United States seems to think that as long as they have a good relationship with the Nigerian government, they can get what they want out of Nigeria, and it doesn't matter how many Christians are being killed there. We think that's pretty immoral, but also quite foolish that you're going to be able to build a durable or sustainable relationship in a country where so much violence is occurring.
All right, Billy, appreciate that conversation there. And that's going to leave us with time on the podcast today for one last thing. We're going to take a look at Proverbs 16:7. When a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him.
Yeah, I think that is a great reminder of the cliche that I hear a lot, but it's a true cliche, which is that we serve an audience of one, right? That should be our focus.
Yeah, absolutely. And even going back to what we were just talking about, there's an element of selfishness in our culture, and the Lord, when we are following him, asks us to, like you're saying, Trey, to only focus on pleasing him, and that involves making peace with our enemies, something that only the Lord can do and something that we should take an interest in because he does.
Absolutely. All right, good spot to leave it on the Quick Start podcast for today. As always, make sure you're getting on over to cbnnews.com and faithwire.com for more news from a Christian perspective. Lord willing, and that creek don't rise up on us. We'll be back here tomorrow with more. God bless. We'll see you then.